Is there somebody who's doing an introduction, or am I kicking it off? Okay. I'm kicking it off. Okay. Everybody sit. Well, I'm really happy to be here with you guys in Henrico County. It's so nice to be at the library. How about giving a round of applause if you love librarians? With Abigail, isn't she running a fantastic? This is going to be a discussion primarily focused on national security issues, but when we get to the Q&A, of course, national security is very broad. It's everything from the military budget to what are we doing about opioids to what are we doing about guns. I mean, there is an awful lot we can talk about. And what we want to do is we want to talk about the things that matter to you. But let me just tell you how we'll do this today. I'll make some opening comments, especially to focus on the work that I do in the Senate on national security issues, being a member of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee. I'm then going to introduce Abigail Spanberger, our wonderful candidate for Congress here in the 7th District. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about two experts we have with us, Ned Price and Karen Jackson, and I'll save the intros of both of these folks because they both have some fairly unique perspectives. Karen is the immediate past Secretary for Technology in Virginia, who worked a lot on cyber issues, electoral security, and others. And Ned was a staff member of the National Security Council in the Obama administration. I'll tell you a little bit about them. They'll each speak for about 5 minutes. Then we will have all spoken, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If you're slow to raise your hand, I may ask a question or two at the end. But if everybody wants to jump right in, I won't even bother to ask questions, and we'll just take questions from you. And when you ask questions, just tell us who you are, and if you want to direct a question to one of us, or if it's just a general question, that would be great. And we'll probably go, what, for about 90 minutes? Is that the goal, team, to go for about 90 minutes? Okay. And let me just say, Maribel Ramos, when I keep saying things, I'm looking for an answer. Maribel is the policy chief of my campaign and has worked with me as governor. So, I am running a campaign for re-election of Virginia that works for all. And it's 3 ideas in 6 words. It's about Virginia. It's about work, the workforce, the dignity of work, rewarding work, honoring work, not just rewarding investment and punishing work. And then it's got to work for all. Those last 2 words are the Pledge of Allegiance. I know many of us were thinking about those values over the weekend with the 1-year commemoration of the horrible tragedy in Charlottesville. We need leaders, all parties, at all levels, who are for all people, who really embrace that value at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance that pulls us together. That's what the campaign is about. It's not about, fundamentally about what's wrong with the others. It's what's right with our country, what we need to do more of in our country, what's right with our Commonwealth, what we need to do more of in our Commonwealth. In the Senate, I guess the other reason I'm running is not just to promote a Virginia that works for all. I run because I like my job. Frustrations abound, and I can tell you about those too, but one of the things I love about my job is I work on issues every day I care deeply about. And probably half of what I do would be in the national security space, broadly defined. The other half is health, education, labor, pension. That keeps me pretty busy, but I'm going to focus at least my opening comments on the national security side. I am rare in the Senate in that I'm both an armed services and a foreign relations committee member. It's rare to be on both. Usually you're on one or the other. But I'm on both, and it's a good fit for Virginia. First, on the armed services side, we are the most militarily connected of any state if you think about it in terms of people. Active duty, Guard, Reserve, DOD civilians, like nurses at the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth. I just was in Portsmouth earlier today. Those are DOD civilians. Or DOD contractors, like our shipbuilders and ship repairers, or military families. We are the most militarily connected of the state, of any of the states, and it matters much to me with one of my kids being in the United States Marines. So I work on those issues every day, but we are not going to be strong if we're just militarily strong. We have to be strong in the diplomacy side. So being on foreign relations, in a state where 1 out of every 9 Virginians was born in another country and still cares very deeply about the places that they know, the places that they might have come from. We have to focus on diplomacy, USAID, international aid, the Peace Corps, Fulbright scholarships. We got to focus on trade. We got to focus on the strength of our example as a nation, setting the right objectives, setting the right example. And so that's the space that I work on. Just a couple of topics before I introduce Abigail. One belief I have that I've pushed ever since I came to the Senate in 2013, we shouldn't be at war unless Congress is willing to vote on it. That's a bottom line issue that is based in the Constitution, right? I haven't chosen that issue just because it's in the Constitution. I've chosen it because it's in the Constitution for a very special reason. Most nations throughout history have allowed the executive to go to war. When Madison and others drafted the Constitution in 1787, they really were trying to fundamentally change sort of the history of it and put war, the decision-making power about whether to be in war, into the elected legislative body. Once declared, the president would manage it, but the president wouldn't initiate it, Congress would. Well, we are in, year 18 of a war against sort of vaguely defined terrorist groups with military authorizations that were voted on by Congress in 2001, 2002. But those authorizations didn't allow military action against Syria, for example, and this president is doing missile strikes and air campaigns against a brutal dictator, I would say, Bashar al-Assad. But he thinks he can do that without seeking the permission of Congress. Those authorizations, I don't think there's any great argument that they cover the now 4-year war against ISIS. Should we be using military action against ISIS? I think we should, but I don't think the president should be able to just do it willy-nilly without coming for a vote of Congress, and thus far Congress has not been willing really to vote on it. And so my first passion, and I will say I have bipartisan support, but not yet enough. Because I have supporters on both sides and in both houses on this, but too many members of Congress are afraid to vote on a war. And I get it, it's a hard vote. I cast a lot of votes on zoning matters as a city council to all kinds of things, but there's never a harder vote. And twice I've had to cast this vote. There's never a harder vote than whether we should use military action against somebody else in the world, especially if you got a kid in the military. It's a very painful vote. But if we're not willing to do it because it's too hard to vote for it, how dare we order people to risk their lives then? So that's an issue I work on that, and I'm going to continue. Just like I think the president shouldn't start a war without Congress, I don't think the president should start a trade war without Congress. Related to the Constitution, and it's also related to national security. So if you look at the Constitution, there are things that are really specific. You cannot be president unless you're 35 years old. And there are things that are pretty vague. No unreasonable search and seizures, no cruel and unusual punishments. Okay, there's specific and there's somewhat subjective. But war making is for Congress, clearly, and so is trade. Trade in the Constitution is for Congress, not for the executive. So when you have a president initiating trade wars by imposing tariffs without Congress, that's not the way it was supposed to be. Sadly, though, Congresses, both parties, during presidencies of both parties over the last 50 years, have deferred a lot, delegated a lot of responsibility. President, you can do it. You can impose it. Abdication of responsibility. It's time to haul some of that power back. Why is it connected to national security? Well, here is one reason, and there are others. We have the president's motive to undertake trade action against China, for example, starts from a place that's hard to argue with. China is a tough competitor who doesn't follow trade rules and even violates, jeopardizes national security through theft of intellectual property of American companies, and not just American companies. So his instinct that there's a national security challenge with China, I agree with that instinct. Two problems with it. First, how do you counter an actor like China? The best way to do it is to put a coalition of other nations together. Europe is suffering the same problem. Canada is suffering the same problem. If you put together a coalition and then you start to pressure China through sanctions or the International Trade Court, the World Trade Organization, you have a better ability to make change. The president is alienating all of the allies. Instead of pulling them together, He's also imposing sanctions against your allies. It's like, you know, you're shooting your own allies before you walk into the fight. And that makes us less safe, and it makes our anti-China activities less likely to succeed. Second, we shouldn't be using a national security waiver to impose penalties against allies. The national security waivers that we've given to the president are to impose trade sanctions against nations that are adversaries. So in the past, they've been used against Libya and Iran. Canada, the longest undefended border in the world is the border between the United States and Canada. No military protection border because they have been with us. We have been allies in every war situation. I have visited Canadian troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Europe, that came to our aid after 9/11, European troops fight with us in Iraq and Afghanistan. I have seen European troops on the battlefield. I have seen injured NATO troops at Landstuhl Military Hospital in Germany. My son deployed on the border of Russia with troops from NATO nations. So the two things that the president is sort of getting wrong in the trade side, and this is why Congress has to haul this back, is he's alienating our allies, which makes us less safe. And by alienating them, he's making it harder for us to assemble the coalitions that we need to do to accomplish legitimately what we might need to do against Chinese violation of international law. So that's an issue. Two, hauling power back to war to Congress and also hauling power back on war making. A third issue is this is ultimately the defense of our nation is about people. About people, and on the Armed Services Committee, one of the main things I try to focus on is the needs of our people, our active duty, our veterans, but also our military families. A particular passion of mine has been the unemployment rate of veterans and military spouses. When I came into the Senate, the unemployment rate of veterans was about twice the national average. Veterans of the Iraq and Afghan war who were enlisted. It was easier, a little bit easier for officers, but the enlisted's unemployment rate was twice the national average. My first bill was designed to get the unemployment rate down. It passed, working with many others, legislators, companies, state governments, governors. The unemployment rate among military vets is now less than the national average, which is a good sign. But a year and a half ago, in a meeting with military spouses at Thomas Nelson Community College in Newport News, they told me that, well, our unemployment rate is not coming down. Our unemployment rate is 3 to 5 times the national average. Today, President Trump at Fort Drum in New York, where the 10th Mountain Division is headquartered, signed the National Defense Authorizing Act. It's the one bill that Congress has passed now 55 years in a row. And that bill contained 2 pieces of legislation that I introduced to try to use some of the same strategies that would get the veterans' unemployment rate down to bring unemployment rate down for military spouses. Glad to talk more about that if folks have questions. Last issue, and this is about security, and there are many other topics, but some will be addressed when I told you last, is the issue of gun violence. This is right here at home. And this is gun crimes that land on the front page newspaper in the United States and around the world when there is a mass shooting around the world. That's what people know about us. But it's also a crime in Highland Park that's not on A1, but that's on B5, or an instance of domestic violence, or a child coming across a loaded gun and accidentally killing him or herself or a friend. We are suffering. We have scar tissue. In Virginia we have it, but everywhere does in the issue of gun violence. And we know enough that we can make our nation safer for ourselves and our children. And so in Congress I have been a champion of what I think are common sense rules like universal background checks so that no one who has been adjudicated as too dangerous to have a weapon can get a weapon, but you have to have universal background checks to do that. I have been other legislation like limitations on high-capacity magazines. Do you know that we actually willingly accept all the time in Virginia law limitations on high-capacity magazines? If you go hunt an animal in Virginia, you are not allowed to have more than 3 rounds in your chamber and magazine. And that has been the rule for years, and we all accept it. Why is that rule in place? Because it would not be fair to an animal to allow somebody with a massive magazine to go hunt an animal with no weapon. It would not be fair. You cannot tell me that we can accept that rule with respect to defenseless animals, but allow weapons of carnage to have unlimited magazines that are only designed to inflict harm or kill. So, what I want to do now is just introduce somebody who I'm really, really impressed by. Abigail Spanberger, I think you know her story, raised right here in Henrico. Wanted to serve our country and chose to serve our country as a CIA analyst and did a superb job in that field, and then decided to move back home to take on the tough security challenge of Cub Scout den mother. Abigail ran against in a very competitive Democratic primary here in the 7th. Another very solid candidate, also with a national security profile, won a significant victory. I have been really pleased to be out on the trail with Abigail, and in some ways, more than the events we do together, it's what I hear people saying when they talk about you when you're not around. The degree to which you've made a huge impression on voters all over the 7th is very impressive. So let's introduce our next Congresswoman from the 7th.
Abigail Spanberger, and I am the Democratic nominee running for Congress in the 7th Congressional District. And my background is that of a CIA case officer. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about what that is. As a case officer, I worked for the CIA in an undercover capacity, working to recruit people, foreign nationals, to provide valuable information related to terrorist threats, related to national security issues. And in order to inform our policymakers, our president, our military, and our diplomats about the most pressing issues facing our country. And as a case officer, I worked with, as a case officer, I worked with our analysts, with our reports officers to make sure that we were understanding gaps in information that existed, understanding what information needed to be collected, so that we could, in fact, inform policymakers, our president, our diplomats, and our military. And I worked under a Republican administration, I worked under a Democratic administration, and for us the goal was ensuring that people could make strong and informed decisions, that people could understand the threats facing our country, and that we could make good decisions based on well-sourced intelligence. And for me, I worked in the DC area for a time. I worked overseas and ultimately finished my time with the CIA on the West Coast. And during my time with the agency, I worked issues as varied as counterterrorism, nuclear proliferation, counter-narcotics, and economic and political reporting as well. And for every challenging situation I ever faced, for every curious situation I ever found myself in the pursuit of really strong, important intelligence, at its core was the desire to serve the mission of protecting this country from a potential terrorist threat and ensuring that we were able to operate, we, the United States of America, were able to operate internationally from a position of knowledge and information. And so for me, my primary motivator in deciding to run for Congress is the fact that we need people in Washington who are committed to making informed decisions. And we need people in Washington who are committed to understanding complex challenges. And I will tell you this, the terrorist threat that exists, that faces this country throughout East Africa, across the Middle East, growing within some of our European partner nations, it's a complex, difficult, challenging situation to understand, and it takes people committed to understanding the interrelated nature of that threat in order to be able to collect the right information that can help us make informed decisions related to counterterrorism policy. And I think the same skill set, the same focus on informed decision making is necessary, because when we look at the challenges facing our healthcare system, facing our educational system, facing our retirement system, and the concerns related to the stability of Social Security and Medicare, all of these things are complicated issues, and we need to understand fully how is that we can meet the goal of fixing through legislation or making better policies and legislation within these areas. And so for me, my motivation for running is to be a part of collecting and understanding the information that we need in order to inform legislation, and being accountable for the decisions that legislators in Washington in the House of Representatives are in fact making. Because when I was out as a CIA officer, one of the primary unique factors of that job is that there's so much autonomy. I would leave our CIA station, I would know where I was going, I would say I'll be back in a couple days, and I would go out. And I would meet with someone, I would collect the information I needed to collect, and I would get back to station a couple days later, write it up, and push it back to Washington so that that information could then be put in the form of a formal intelligence report and ultimately potentially be pushed to the president within the presidential daily brief for a portion of it. And that level of autonomy, that level of responsibility is a unique experience, understanding that I was on the line for the information that I was collecting, understanding that I was on the line for every question I did ask and every question I didn't ask, and every bit of information I came back with or every bit of information I might have not come back with. And I think that that's a fundamental piece, a fundamental level of responsibility that we need to see heightened in Washington. And the senator was talking about our authorized use of military force. This is something that I'm very, very passionate about, because we need members of Congress who are willing to take ownership for the decisions that they make. And that starts with actually making decisions. And it's hard, I understand that, because it's much easier to let someone else work on an 18-year-old AUMF and say, well, he chose to do that, it's on him. But in fact, it's on the House of Representatives, it's on Congress for not standing up and saying, we want to update authorized use of military force, we want to be engaged, we want to have accountability for the choices that we are making, for the places we are sending our military officers, and ultimately when diplomats and intelligence officers and the like follow them as well. And that is incredibly important to me, because it is about accountability and it is about responsibility. And to wrap it up, really it's about problem solving. It's about understanding the problems that are facing this country and working to actually solve them. And when I work side by side with other case officers, and we'd sit in a room going through the challenges, going through a list of the information we knew and the list of the requirements that we were going out to collect on, it didn't matter who was a Republican, it didn't matter who was a Democrat. Fundamentally, we were working together to keep our country safe, to thwart the terrorist threat, and to inform our policymakers back home. And we need people in Washington who are willing to work together, to have hard conversations, and who are prioritizing the needs of this country together. And thank you.
Somebody who believes in facts, information, and making decisions, how delightful you are. Let me tell you who Karen and Ned are. So first, Karen is a wonderful friend. I hired her to work with me when I was governor in the information technology area. By the time Terry McAuliffe became governor, she then became our Secretary of Technology. And in that capacity, she was dealing both with the technology needs of state government, but also the technology sector of the Virginia economy and how we can use technology to better serve our population. Karen also had the challenge of working with Governor McAuliffe, especially in the last year of his administration, after we saw a national election get hacked by a foreign adversary. Since elections are run by states and boards of elections at the local level, it falls pretty hard on the shoulders of state government to try to protect elections. And so in 2017, there was a great worry about that in Virginia. Governor McAuliffe did a number of things, including moving us to every ballot has a paper verification on it, which was a really good move. Karen was part of all of that. Karen's going to talk a little bit about her thoughts in the cyber world, including some of the opportunities that cyber offer to young people in Virginia in terms of workforce needs and careers. And then we'll go to Ned Price. Ned was on the National Security Council staff, which is the inside the White House staff that advises the president on, that prepares many of the briefs that Abigail was talking about. She would gather information and present it. The NSC is very focused on advice to the president about national security situations on law firms all over the world. And Ned was a key advisor to President Obama, and before that he was also at the CIA as their chief public spokesperson. So he's going to talk in a little bit more detail. They'll probably each talk for 3 to 5 minutes each about their own take on national security issues in 2018, and then we'll open it up and take your questions. We'll start with Karen.
Thanks, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here today with Abigail and the Senator and Ned. We've already had one great conversation this morning down in Norfolk, and some of the things that came out of that discussion really resonated around we resonated more around the topic of, it's the people behind all the technology that are truly what makes it work. Whether it's the willingness to look at facts and figures and draw conclusions. The technology is important, and we have lots of that now, and there's a lot of it that's really fun, but it's truly having people that are educated, having people that have discernment to make good decisions based on what they have at their disposal. There really is what makes this tick. And that's what we need more of in Washington, quite frankly, all across the nation. The uniqueness about cybersecurity is this is not a typical war that we've seen fought before. It's in a vector that is unique. States find themselves in a very interesting position between the federal lawmaking that goes on and the need to secure not only what we have as information on you as citizens, but we also have to figure out how to translate what's going on to the citizens and make you aware and make everyone aware of the opportunities, as the Senator said, around the careers that are available in cybersecurity, the need for the personnel that is coming, and it's coming fast. We have 36,000 open cyber jobs in Virginia as of January. And that's a large mountain to climb, and Virginia's not the only state with those sorts of needs. We talk to any governor, and they're experiencing a workforce challenge in this space as well. So we've got to think very creatively about how we involve our veterans, how we involve big career changers, how we involve spouses and National Guard members, and it's going to be through partnership. And it's going to be through partnerships that don't look like the partnerships necessarily that we've seen in the past. We activated the National Guard to help us with the election challenge because they brought a skill set and opportunities to us as a state that we knew we needed. We partner with them, we partner with the veterans to make sure that we have cyber training available, especially in the Quantico area, Hampton Roads area, to make sure that we're getting the best and brightest out of the military, and we're doing everything that we can to keep them here in Virginia. The students, we've got to have more students. I see some young faces scattered around in here. I'm going to say $88,000 average salary, and I'm going to say we've got a lot of resources here in the Richmond area and throughout the state that can help you get the education. But we need support from the schools, we need support from the parents, we need support from the guidance counselors, because we've got to get our up and coming students to understand that cybersecurity is not a flash in the pan. These are attacks that are getting more and more heinous, they're becoming more and more frequent. The Commonwealth has 76 million cyber attacks against our internal network in 2017. So this is not something that's simple. 76 million. Varying degrees of sources, varying degrees of severity, but it's going to get worse. 36,000 open cyber jobs, 76 million attacks. Do the math. We need help. We're going to continue to need help, whether it's at the federal level or the state level. We all have to think corporately about how we can share information on the threats, how we can unilaterally act on the threats, and what we have to do to make sure that we have the personnel in place to be able to make the informed decisions once we know what those threat vectors are. Throw out another quick little tidbit. With the Internet of Things and all the devices that everybody thinks is very fun to attach to their coffee pots and pot pots and everything that you can now network, 20 billion devices are supposed to be connected to the Internet by 2020. Each one of those is a cyber vector that can and will be attacked. And we've got to work more closely with our federal partners to make sure that we put standards in place for these devices that will be connecting to the network. Because what you connect to the network ultimately connects back to the electric grid, which ultimately connects back. And so we're much more connected than we ever have been. And we're going to need to do a lot more work on standards and policies that span all the way from the federal government down to the local level to make sure that our elections and quite frankly, our citizens stay as safe as possible.
Thank you, Karen. Now we'll go to Ned, and then we'll open it up for questions. Ned, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Senator, for having me. Karen and Abigail, thank you so much. As you all know, of course, Abigail has spent much of her career in the CIA, as did I, whereas Abigail, however, was out risking life and limb in foreign countries around the world. I was an analyst based in Langley, Virginia. The only risk I encountered was that of carpal tunnel syndrome, so we all owe a profound debt of gratitude to Abigail for her service over there. Today to speak to the threats we face. Of course, there are any number of them. Some are traditional, that of terrorism, infectious disease, cyber threats. Some are unique to this administration, the threat of top staffers reporting in the Situation Room, for example. But I wanted to focus on just three at the top, and then I look forward to the discussion as well. Let me start by noting a threat that's not often appreciated, but something I know is very personal to me and to, I presume, Abigail as well. That's the denigration and the slander we've seen from this president towards the men and women of our intelligence community. We've heard this in many forms over time. Sometimes it's been fairly subtle. The president just outright rejecting the high confidence findings that Russia attacked our democracy in 2016. But sometimes it's been more damaging. It wasn't all that long ago the president compared our law enforcement and our intelligence professionals to Nazis. And for me, these attacks became personal when on President Trump's first full day in office, he went out to Langley, Virginia, as I'm sure Abigail knows well, stood in front of the memorial wall at Langley, the most solemn site in all of CIA headquarters, and bragged about the size of his inaugural crowd the previous day. And as I watched that on TV, all I could think about was that the president was physically obscuring some of the stars, the 117 stars that were etched on the wall at that time, commemorating the fallen men and women at the CIA. One of my mentors was on that wall. I'm sure Abigail and I both know others on that wall as well. I resigned shortly thereafter from the CIA, and I know the workforce as a whole has really taken a tremendous hit in terms of demoralization. And this is something that is more significant than just a less productive workforce. This is about our national security. We've of course heard anecdotally of people leaving places like the FBI, the CIA. Just last month, 3 senior cyber officials from the FBI resigned. Cyber officials, people we need to fight these threats that Karen was just referring to. So when this happens, when we endure these attacks, we are all made less safe by this president. We may not see the implications of it today or tomorrow, but I fear we will pay for it over time. We also, secondly, we can't talk about this phenomenon without spending just a moment talking about Russia and the threat we face from Moscow, from Vladimir Putin, from the...
Give judges in the Article 3 branch life tenure so they can say, you can't do that, and they won't lose their job as a result. Let governors do things. You're out of the Paris Climate Accord, Mr. President, don't worry, we're staying in. Let the press have the ability to investigate and counter error. But the most important responsibility that was allocated in 1787 was to you, is to all of us. And importantly, one cool thing about doing this job is you realize important things that you learned in 4th grade, about civics. The role assigned to the citizens is not just voting. They got a lot wrong in the Constitution. 3/5, a slave is 3/5 they got a lot wrong. But they got some things right. And one thing they got right, even in 1787, they knew voting would not be enough. So they guaranteed in the First Amendment the right of people to peacefully assemble. They guaranteed in the First Amendment the right of the people to petition government for redress of grievances. They knew that voting would be enough, that they had to give more protection to individuals to assemble and petition. Anything they protected to encourage it. Anything they encouraged, they did, because they knew that a democracy would need it in order to thrive and survive. And so what we see, when you see a women's march with more attendees than the inauguration. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, March for Our Lives, when you see spontaneous protests after 5 o'clock on a Friday when they announced the Muslim travel ban, and all over the United States people turn out to airports. It's one thing to go to Dulles, there's international flights there, but people went to the Indianapolis airport to turn out and hug people coming from Chicago and Columbus. And the best evidence of this popular engagement was what happened in Virginia. Our race in Virginia was the first big, meaningful statewide race since the inauguration. There had been special elections in gerrymandered House districts, but in terms of a big statewide race, all 3 statewide offices, all 100 members of the House of Delegates, and because of your energy and engagement, the Democratic Party performance in Virginia in 2017 was the best performance in any year, in any election in Virginia by the Democrats since the 1870s. We know that we swept all the statewide offices, including electing the second African American to statewide office in Virginia history, Justin Fairfax. But focus on the House races. We won 15 houses. 11 of the 15 were women. Most of them were first-time candidates. Asian American, African American, Latino American, Muslim American, immigrant born, LGBT, openly transgender. A whole lot of people who had been told you can't win said, yeah, I'm running in. People have work to do then. After November, I think we could have a good November. We'll have work to do to fix things, but we can fix anything we put our mind to if we are engaged as we know to be.
National security inherently involves a number of issues outside our borders. It also inherently involves energy, where we get our energy, and also specifically energy storage. When energy storage is coupled with renewables such as wind turbines and solar and PV cars, we can see that our own national security is strengthened. They already do this on military bases. Would it be possible to enact a policy of energy storage similar to what other states such as California, Iowa, New York, and Massachusetts have already done? This is open to the whole table.
Yeah. I'm glad to throw something out unless one of you guys want to jump into it. I mean, I'll just say something and others say, man, this is such a smart idea. And you're right. It's not just being done on military bases. Our military is figuring out ways to have 4 deployed units with their own energy generating capacity, because it turns out that one of the most dangerous things to do is to be driving a fuel convoy back and forth to a 4 deployed unit in a war zone. And if you could put 4 deployed units out with solar panels or wind or ability to generate their own energy, that is much safer for everybody. So it's safety of folks in the field, but it's also, as you point out, safe for us. Now, there have been some dramatic advances in low and no carbon energy and energy storage, driven by tremendous market interest in making these advances. That's good. Energy, I think we all know, energy will likely be the industry of the future, and innovation in energy to move towards low and no carbon, more conservation, more efficiency, that is very powerful. The problem right now is this administration is ceding the leadership. By backing out of the Paris Accord, by the president saying that climate change is a Chinese hoax and the vice president saying that it's a myth, we've ceded leadership, and that's bad news because this is an energy of the future, an industry of the future. The good news is the U.S. backing away from the table is not stopping the flow of innovation investments to move this down the road, because everybody with a brain knows that this is going to be a really big opportunity in the future. It would be such a shame if the U.S. backs away from the table and we let other nations race too far ahead of us. But there are great private sector innovators in the U.S. that are doing this. Your question about could we do more in terms of national policy, I think we ought to have a renewable portfolio standard nationally, like many states do. Those work fine, requiring a certain percentage of energy be done through renewable resources. And as part of that, we should also be both creating incentives and also making investments in research. And research into battery and storage technology is one of the areas I think could be most productive going forward. I'm going to come right here in the green blouse.
So when we win back a Democratic Congress this fall, one that the Congress can check Trump, especially as it relates to national security and foreign policy, and this is for whoever wants it.
I'll get started on this one. So, in winning back the Congress, then we would have the chairpersonships across the committees, and I think that it's incredibly important that we have the ability to call witnesses and investigate concerns that we have. And that's one piece of it, particularly as it pertains to Russia, particularly as it pertains to what happened in Helsinki as an example, or where interests may lie within the administration and how that may counter or complicate U.S. foreign policy. It also, I think, just overall provides a greater number of voices who can advocate and stand up for things that are important to national security, funding aid internationally. And from my time at CIA, and I know agree with this point, where there are vacuums throughout the world, someone will fill those vacuums. And so the aid that the United States government provides, while altruistic in many ways, is also 100% a national security priority. And that is something that we need more voices in Congress to understand and make sure that we are continuing to prioritize aid and we are continuing to prioritize diplomacy. Because as General Mattis once said, if you do not fully fund the State Department, you will be dividing more ammunition. And so we need to have more voices who are advocating for aid, for diplomacy, who are listening to the educated, well-informed assessments of our intelligence community writ large and questioning them, pushing back, yes, but also listening to the concerns that they may convey related to related to election security and other things. And so overall, I think it's those two things of having the committee chairpersonships, but also being able to, in general, have more voices advocating for things that will keep us safe on a national level, international level.
So I'm going to slightly broaden your question about when the Dems take the House or the Senate, and we could take the Senate. It's probably a harder map, but we could do it. You said, how can we check? I'm going to focus on, I don't want to just play defense, I want to play offense on something. So I'm going to focus on that. I will say, if you take the Senate, you do not have to have an anti-education person at the head of this. Science person at the head of the EPA. The Senate can be a good checker, but what I'm interested in is, say let's just assume we just take the House. I would say kind of the Vegas odds right now would be we have a slightly better than 50% chance taking the House, slightly worse 50% taking the Senate. We're going full out to take both. But just say we take the House. There's some real opportunities for us. We're just a few votes away in the House from passing universal background check, for example. And the votes in the Senate are there if the House were to pass something and send it to us. The Senate's probably not going to do it if the House is going to kill it, but I think the votes in the Senate would be there. That is pro-security, and President Trump in the past has said that he supports background record checks. Now, President Trump does threaten to veto a lot of stuff, but I will say this, how many vetoes has President Trump done yet? 0. He talks about vetoes a lot. When the bill gets on his desk, he suddenly thinks it was his idea. He signed about 5 bills of mine. I never get invited to signing ceremonies. He sort of thinks it's his. So I would say put a background check on his desk. I think we can put comprehensive immigration reform on his desk. In the Senate, we had nearly 70 votes for comprehensive immigration reform in 2013. The House wouldn't do anything with it. But there are sufficient votes to get over the 60-vote threshold on a comprehensive bill right now. It's just that the House has been impossible. But you get to the House where it's a straight majority. In the Senate, you got to get 60 votes to do most legislation. On the House, majority rules. You give them a majority, they'll be able to come up with about 5 unifying principles. And I wouldn't tell the House what those would be, but I would think universal background check and comprehensive immigration reform would be 2 really good ones. But they could come up with about 5 where they could get that bill through the House. They could get it over to the Senate. We would then have a good shot of getting the votes in the Senate. We'd then have to play with the president's veto pin. But again, thus far, he hasn't vetoed the bill. So there's some, not just check, but there's some offense opportunities if the Dems take the House.
I can add something. So there's actually, the senator mentioned a background check bipartisan bill before the House of Representatives now. It has 208 co-sponsors, and it is a bipartisan bill. And it would provide for background checks to be applied for all firearms purchases. There are exemptions for family and friend point of sale, person to person. But this bill has tremendous support. It's just a matter of having people in the House that are willing to push it, because when it gets pushed, it already has bipartisan support, and it is a bill that would get passed on the Senate side, at least so it seems. So there are a lot of places where we really can see forward momentum on some of the issues that are most important to people throughout our community.
I'm gonna come right here, and then there's somebody in the back. If you're standing against the back wall, I'm coming to you last. Here, and then here, we have 2 more questions.
We know that America has been built on generations of immigrant families and individuals who have created a diverse background and who have helped us build all of our institutions. And I think a lot of people are distraught with what we've seen at the border recently with immigration and how ICE has been treating people who are trying to find more opportunity. And many people have been calling for the abolishment of ICE. If you were to go into Congress, how would you kind of address this issue?
My view, and then I'll let Abby speak, my view is we don't like ICE because we hate the policies. The policies are bad. There's going to have to be immigration enforcement, but we will always be down on ICE as long as there's this nexus of cruelty and incompetence at the policy level that this administration is pushing at.
Amen.
These individual agents, and look, there may be some bad actors, like there are bad actors all over the place, but bottom line, they're being directed in a policy. This family separation, it was cruel and it was incompetently administered. These are the hallmarks of the way these guys do things. And so, obviously, we don't like what we're seeing on the enforcement side. But I think what we ought to do is fix the policies. If we fix the policies, I think we'll be more comfortable with the enforcement. So I would focus immigration issues on doing comprehensive reform. The bill that we did in 2013 was very comprehensive. It was path to citizenship for people who have been here. They stay for a long time, pay taxes, do criminal background checks. It was protection for dreamers. It was protection for TPS recipients. It was helping employers figure out the bona fides of their employees. It was border security. It was visa reform for students, seasonal workers, tourists. It was all of that, and we had nearly 70 votes in the Senate. And I think if you did a bill like that, and what the House would probably do is sort of look at our bill and say, okay, now 5 years has passed, we've learned some things to make it even better. But I think if you do that, you're going to end up, of course, with immigration enforcement, but they will be enforcing policies that are humane, that promote the kind of workforce that we want, that are true to our Statue of Liberty values. And I think we'll feel much more comfortable with the way enforcement is done. But as long as the policies are bad, we're gonna not like what's being done in enforcement.
So I would just add, so as a CIA officer, I worked counterterrorism, I worked narco trafficking, I used to report on drug cartels throughout Latin America. So I think what is so frequently done is we conflate immigration and border security. And in fact, there are a lot of places where they interrelate, absolutely. But if we are looking at how it is that we can reform our immigration system, that is a problem that we need to solve. That is, we need to provide greater certainty to people who are coming to this country. We need to fix our immigration system overall. But we can absolutely do that separately, separate from protecting and ensuring that we have a safe border, that we know who's coming into this country, and that we are protecting against threats to this country, be it through terrorism, be it through something, through drug trafficking or human smuggling or the rest. And I think the senator is exactly right that when we look at what we've seen along the southern border, the problem is the policy that people are enforcing, and that is what we need to fix. Before I was a CIA officer, I was a federal agent. I worked narcotics and money laundering cases, and I did work some drug cases with ICE at the time, with HSI under ICE at the time that the agency was first being formed. It's important to recognize the broad types of investigations that HSI under ICE does, in fact. But when we're looking at policy-related concerns, it's the policy we need to fix if we're going to move to a place where we are not seeing the sort of egregious policy that so negatively impacts families, such as what we've seen along the southern border.
Can I, and I want to give you just on this 2 other factoids before I go to the last question, of how, like, the president's, hard edge on immigration, he's often just getting the facts completely wrong.
Amen.
So here's one. What does he want border security money for? I voted for border security money, but I don't want to waste it. He wants it all to build a wall. 40% of the people who are in this country without documents, who are here illegally, came in on a tourist visa and then they stayed past it. You could build a 1 million foot wall. It had anything to do with it. So if you really want to focus on immigration reform and trying to get this right, you wouldn't just spend all the money on a wall. You'd spend money on technology. You'd spend money in a lot of different ways. The simple solution that sounds great, and oh, by the way, Mexico was supposed to pay for it, no way to pay for it. Turns out that's not really an answer to the realities of the problem. I'll give you another one. President Trump says all these kids come to border, they're all MS-13. It's just criminals run wild. Okay, now I'll do a little stat. Now I only learned this in the last month. Right now, the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the United States, which is part of HHS, which gets the authority of kids if they're arrested coming across the border, or if they turn themselves in and seek asylum while their petition is being adjudicated. They're right now in control of about 13,000 kids in the United States. And these kids are in state, local, federal facilities, foster homes, nonprofit charities. It takes a lot of people to manage 13,000 kids, all right? If the kids are particularly poorly behaved or gang connected, they get put in an escalated detention facility. So most of them are in sort of lower security environments, but if they're problem kids, gang connected or otherwise problems, they get put in an escalated detention facility. I met the head of ORR about a month ago and I said, oh, interesting. So out of the 13,000, how many pose such serious security risks? The president says they're all in. How many pose such serious security risks that they're in the elevated security facility? Remember, these kids have been traumatized, right? So that can produce a lot of dangerous behavior. How many do you think are in the escalated security facilities? 80. 80 out of 13,000, right? That's about 5 or 6%. I mean, no, it's like 0.6. Thank you, man. 0.5 or 0.6. And so that tells you what we're dealing with these kids. They're fleeing trauma, they're fleeing violence, but the notion that they're all MS-13 people is just so ridiculous. Last question here on the black shirt.
First of all, thank you guys for coming today. I really appreciate it. My name is Robert Lotz. I have moved here, and sorry, sir, but I grew up and was born in Pakistan and traveled in Afghanistan years ago. I'm 61. I'm a math teacher in Henrico County at Moody Middle School. This demographic here, you're preaching to the choir. I have two questions. Number one, how are you going to reach the, largely rural, less educated, disenfranchised, angry white males who voted for Trump? How are you going to do that? Thinking ahead, who's going to be the person that you're going to put forward to fight that in 2020? Those two questions. I'm afraid. I really am afraid at this election coming up because I think it's a watershed for our country. I'm emotional right now to that.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you two who have lived abroad and have seen it not only here but also seen it from the
I've had
other
people
angle.
spit on me for my skin color.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people see, wow, the stakes are so high for us. So, you know, how to reach out, and then I'll give a very fast answer on 20 that I think is something we should really think hard about. How to reach out. We spend time going to a lot of places where we're not going to get 50% of it. I mean, I spend a lot of time this weekend. I'm going to be campaigning all over Southside Virginia. I'm going to be in a lot of jurisdictions.
I saw you on Tangier Island, by the way.
Yeah, but I'm going to be in a lot of places in Southside this weekend where I normally do not win, but you go to the places that you will lose so you don't lose badly. And I'm going to be, the following weekend, I'm going to be in
Yeah, you only
Southwest
need 2 or
Virginia
3%.
the whole time. You go to where you're going to lose so you don't lose badly. And you know what? People in those parts, they're sort of not expecting you to come. They're really open to hearing the message. And even if they don't vote for you, it starts to open up a possibility that, well, maybe these were the guys that did Medicaid expansion, which helped rural Virginia probably as much as it starts to open up the dialogue. It may not convert them immediately, start to open it up. So I've seen Abigail doing events all over the place. Hey, not every place in the 7th is like super blue. There's no substitute for presence. That Joe Manchin, my friend from West Virginia, says they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And presence is the door opener, and if you're not present, they don't care what your policy is, you got to be present. So we're doing outreach in that way. So 2020, Terry McAuliffe was on TV yesterday and said something about this that I really agree with. Don't worry about 2020. Try to maximize 2018, because here's what will happen. I think 2018 will be like 2017 in Virginia. It has the prospects of being like 2017. A lot of energy, a lot of first-time candidates that maybe they never paid their dues and came to a county Democratic committee meeting, but they just said, look, I'm going to run. I don't care how hard my race is. I don't care if people said I could never win. I'm going to run anyway. And the party wisely didn't try to tell everybody, hey, look, here's the talking point. Get in line and say this. They probably had an inclination to do that, but when they saw all the energy, it's like, okay, just go for it. That's what we need to do in 2018, but then we need to be rigorous about, well, so what did we learn from 2018? Who did better with factory workers than we usually do? Who did better in Appalachia than we usually do? Who did better with farmers than we usually do? How did they do better? What can we learn from the message, the policy, the way they talk, how they interacted? And I think when you see how we do in 2018, if we're really honest about the lessons and talk about it in a serious way, I think it will point the direction for the kind of campaign that will be successful in 2020. And I feel very, very good if we learn, if we take the time to learn. You know, sometimes you learn from mistakes, or after failure you try to learn, but after you do something well, you're like, oh, it's great, and then you move on to the next one. No. If we have a good November, and I think we will, we still need to really dig into what was good about it. And then that will point us a direction for 2020. Listen, it's time to end our hour and a half in the sweat lodge here. I again really appreciate Abigail, who was fantastic, to Ned, to Karen, to the rest of
the tremendous information black hole. The president held a 90-minute one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. No, just a note-taker in the room, no other aides. When Secretary Pompeo, the Secretary of State, went before Senator Kane's committee, he would not answer any questions about what happened in that 90-minute meeting, which I think should raise questions for all of us. All the while, we have seen President Trump essentially give Putin a green light to continue his attacks on our democracy by not standing up to Russia, by not clearly and unequivocally telling the Russian leader that we know what they did, that he believes his intelligence community, and that it must stop. That the president has essentially signaled that he is willing to countenance, he is willing to accept continuous attacks on our democracy, and that is something that we cannot accept. And this brings me to one final trend that we're going to have to reverse if we're going to be able to safeguard our interests and continue to seize opportunities. And that relates to the last point. Our adversaries often know where we stand, and we often, as a country under President Trump, stand with them, but our allies too often don't. This is a president that has hugged Vladimir Putin, has hugged other autocrats from countries like China and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and others around the globe, while he consistently picks fights with some of our friends. Sometimes it's in the context of a trade war, but all too often it is seeming to pick a fight because they represent democracy, they represent the values and the interests the United States has always stood for, at least over the past 70 years, we know that America needs friends in the world, not just for some international relations theory. What we know to be true is that we can't be the world's policeman. And if we are to confront the challenges that are out there, if we are to seize opportunities, we need partners. We need partners out there to go along with us, whether it's to take on terrorist groups like ISIL, whether it is to take on infectious diseases like Ebola, like we did in 2014 in West Africa with any number of countries. We cannot do all this alone. If we try and do it all alone, we will bleed ourselves with blood and treasure, and that's not something we can accept. So over the past 18 months, we've pushed away friends, we've pushed away allies, we have dismissed and really undermined the institutions like NATO that have helped keep us safe over the past 70 years. You know, we were promised America first. Instead, we are today less respected in the world. America has less credibility. And with that, we have less ability to mobilize our friends and our allies and the partners we will need. And that's precisely why we need people like Abigail, why we're lucky to have people like
Say your name, and if you want to direct it to one person or all of us, that's fine, and I'll start right here. And this is above the offices.
Milton Cloud, and I live here in Henrico. And my question is to Abigail. When you're elected in the fall, go to Washington, which committees do you think would be the best committees for you to serve on the House and why?
And you might repeat the question so everybody in the back can hear.
Sure. The question was, when I'm elected, what are the committees that I think I would best utilize my skill set, I believe is the question. And why? So, two of my top choices, one would be the Education and Workforce Development Committee. And I would choose this, I would want to be on this committee because I am really, really passionate about the idea that we need to long-term plan for the opportunities that will exist in the future, future business, future technology, longer range, and allow for that to inform some of the educational policy that we choose to pursue across our public schools. And I think that far too often we have people who think in 2 or 6 year increments. And really when we're looking at our labor force, when we're looking at how our future projections related to the labor force could inform some of the decisions we're making related to educational policy, it's incredibly important that we have people who are looking towards a longer term vision and who want to see things on a longer term scale. Secondly, I would love to serve. I think that it would be a great use of my background and skill set to serve on the House Intelligence Committee. There currently is one member of the House of Representatives, a Republican from Texas, who's a former case officer. And frankly, it's a unique experience. And having been the one collecting information and having been the one running programs that were in fact briefed to the HIPC or the CISI as I did during my times overseas, I think that it would be a great background and experience that would provide a good perspective to other members of the House.
And I just mentioned, if the Democrats take the House, we think we have a solid chance of doing it. Bobby Scott, the 3rd District Congressman from Virginia, is likely to be the chair of the Educational Workforce Committee. I'm going to go back and forth and just work my way back. Yes.
My name is Holly. Actually, I have 2 questions. So, Ms. Spanberger, how did you get your information? You were on the ground giving some of the information. Because there's a lot of talk about kids having to get information so they go to the internet and Wikipedia and then report back. How did you get your information?
And why don't you ask both at once and show
Okay,
which one?
Karen, I just want to know who's doing the cyber attacks. I'm just curious.
The question was, how is it I was getting the information I was collecting? So I, as a case officer, I was involved in what's called HUMIN, which is Human Intelligence Collection. I was meeting with people, developing relationships with people who had access to vital information, be it terrorist-related organizations or nuclear-related intelligence or any variety of other additional topics. People who had first-hand, second-hand access to that information. And I was sitting down and sometimes rolling around in the car as I write furiously, all sorts of, a little bit like Hollywood, mostly not like Hollywood. and just, face to face, asking people the questions who were directly involved in the things that they wanted to know about.
So very quickly, it was a broad spectrum. So we have people. Oh, so she was asking about the source of the attacks on the infrastructure of the Commonwealth, the cyber attacks. We had some that were as benign as kids, people that were just trying to test to see where they could get. It's hard to tell exactly who's on the other end of those attacks, but they were from inside the U.S. We did have others that came from other nations
Nice for coming the farthest. Bangkok, Thailand, to the library.
Yeah. I'm from this area. I'm helping my mom do that surgery.
Absentee ballot.
But I think your puts on Russia. This is my opinion. I have a political science background. I'm also a geologist, and I'm from the mining industry. The climate change issue has been said to be the #1 by our generals, by everybody, the #1 security threat, not just to us, but the entire world. Our president has waged a war on all of our natural resources. He wants to shrink the national forest land so it can be exploited. This is my understanding, just the reason I'm so upset about this. He just started threatening the endangered, trying to go back on the Endangered Species Act, which would open up their lands to exploitation. And just so everybody knows, as a geologist, I'm telling you, the richest resources in the world are now falling out in the Arctic, and there's a bunch of governments out there prospering. Putin wants it all. Okay? And I know that our president is also invested in the energy sector. And I'm wondering, all these secret meetings, all these policies, all this misinformation that he's given in regards to the environment, seems like to me it's a smoke screen to dominate these resources and exploit them in the Arctic. How would you feel about it?
So the question was about the president's policies towards Russia and specifically Putin's interest in the Arctic. Look, I think we can only say what we've seen so far, and that is a president who, at every turn, has kowtowed to Vladimir Putin. And to be fair, this administration, in some cases, has tried to take aggressive measures against the Russians. We did expel some spies. We kicked them out of a facility on the West Coast. But for some reason, we have a president who, by many accounts, has told his staffers not to talk about that, to downplay when those things happen, to try and keep the peace personally between himself and Putin. And so I think that raises a lot of questions about the president personally. There are a lot of theories out there. I think some are fairly extreme. But I think what we can say is, at the very least, there is a conflict of interest. And that conflict of interest can be something as unthinkable as some sort of long-standing relationship between President Trump and the Kremlin. I don't put much stock in that. I know some people are suggesting as much. But what we know to be true is that this president ran, and his son still run, a company that acquired a lot of money from Russian sources.
Yes.
So at the very least, you can imagine that we now have a president in office who wants to keep that source of funding open, so that when he is no longer president, whenever that is, he can go back and reap those benefits. So I think what we have seen time and again is a commander-in-chief who hasn't put our interests first, who has not put America first. He has consistently put Trump, put his family, put his close associates ahead of our interests and ahead of our national security. And just as you were suggesting, I think Putin is reaping the benefits of that, whether it's with the Arctic, whether it's in Syria, whether it's with us. Exactly.
Democracy, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but you brought up a great point. For Putin to, first off, they had a 2-term limit for Russia. Then his public Medvedev came in and took away the 2-term limit, and now he's here to stay, right? So to hold on to power, there's about a 50-50 split between democracy and go back to communism, former USSR. He has to delegitimize democracy in America because, as an American, the people around the world have seen us. And under Obama, it was amazing the way the foreign national sources understand hope. And I want to cry right now because I've been to the radio for 6 years, and I'm good.
And I want to come to this. Yeah, this is very, very, very important. let me say a couple of things, and then maybe Karen say them as well. So, the question was, what is the state doing to protect the upcoming election? So let's start with the bad news, and then I'll get to some good news. The bad news is no governor, no mayor, no board of supervisors has any confidence that this administration will lift a finger to help. Because since this president continues to say there wasn't election hacking in 2016, even though all of his security team says there was, if the president says there wasn't, then nobody has any confidence that the administration will do it. So that's the bad news. Two bits of good news. One is, even though the president is continuing to demean the notion that there was attacks on the election system, at least in Congress, there is a bipartisan recognition and willingness to fund election security. So the budget deal we did in March put $380 million this year into states to help them deal with election security. We just had a vote on the Democratic side. We thought we needed another quarter vote, 250 million. We tried to do that, and the Republicans voted it down. However, they did join with us on the 380 million. So there are resources coming to states and localities. The second bit of good news is that's where the elections are run. If they were run at the federal level, we should really be worried. But they're not run at the federal level. They're run at the state and local level. Now, depending upon what state you're in, you know, you could have a whole lot of worry or a little bit, but I will say this, beginning in the last year of the McAuliffe administration, there was a very significant awareness. Okay, there was an attempt to penetrate the Virginia electoral system. It failed, but they'll likely do it again. Governor McAuliffe was very, very nervous about an attack on the 2017 election. The only, you know, along with New Jersey, was the only big statewide election that day, so we were kind of a sitting duck out there. And they took a lot of steps to protect the election, including switching state law over so that in Virginia you have to have a paper record of every ballot. Now that ended up being critical to reasons. If you don't have a paper record, you really can't do meaningful reasons. So we've done those things, and I know that Governor Northam is every bit as focused about this. So federal government is funding. We're not getting help from the president, but we are getting funds, and we have a governor that cares about it. Most of you maybe know this, but in case you don't, elections in Virginia, the state board of elections is 3 people, 2 from the governor's party, 1 from the other party, and every locality has a 3-member board of elections, 2 from the governor's party, 1 from the other party. So there is the Democratic majority on all of the local and state boards of elections right now because of Ralph Northam and the governor. Karen, do you want to talk about it from a technology standpoint?
Just a quick add-on to that. I'm not in the current administration, so I'm not going to speak to specifics about what they're doing, but we left a very, very solid foundation for them to stand on. As I mentioned, we use the National Guard. I suspect that they will be doing that again, do vulnerability testing on the networks. The one thing you have to remember is the state infrastructure covers the Board of Elections 365 days a year. We don't just spin up security for that agency just for the period of an election. So there's a chief information security officer, and I quite frankly think Virginia has one of the best in the nation. The day that he leaves is the day we should all be really worried. But he's in place 365 working with a chief information officer and a team in elections that also work with their counterparts in the intelligence world at the federal level to share information, to put up vulnerability tests, penetration testing, all of those things so that we do that 365. And so we ramp it up when it comes time to an election. We obviously take advantage of the resources that are provided by the federal government, but we don't rely solely on that because we have to keep them safe the rest of the year and in between elections as well. So there's a very, very solid foundation there, and whatever funds come down will be used to augment the work that's already being done.
And
Senator Kane, could you comment on the Kavanaugh nomination?
yeah, so
I'm sorry, that's a hot topic.
No, I mean, that's not a hot topic for me. I was a city councilman in Richmond. The Kavanaugh nomination. So, first, I mean, look, the Republicans should follow the precedent they set, which was, if there is a vacancy that is shortly before an election, you should wait till the American public says what they want before you vote on the vacancy. If that was the case for a vacancy occurring 9 months this vacancy occurred on July 31st with Justice Kennedy's retirement, so it certainly should affect 4 months. Maybe that's 3 months. They're not going to follow their own precedent. I don't mean this shock. If they want to push, and they're showing every bit of evidence that they will, they can, with 51 currently, force a vote on this before November.
But they don't have the Kane.
Let me finish. So that's if they want to push, they can. All Democrats could oppose, and we could try to delay it. But if they want it, they can get it. Here's what I do. I have a rule about nominees. I do not declare on a nominee that I do not personally know until after their hearing. And the reason I take that rule is that the hearings are important. And if everybody declares where they are before the hearing, then why have the hearing? And actually, they'll start to shorten the hearing. They'll make it immediate so that you don't have time to do the research. They'll say, we've already made up your mind anyway. What does it matter? So my rule is to not declare until there's a hearing. I have said when Kavanaugh was nominated, I have a series of concerns. I'm concerned about his track record of being overly deferential to executive power. I think we need an Article 3 branch that's independent, not a rubber stamp. I'm concerned about his rulings about health care, especially the Affordable Care Act. I'm concerned about his positions on women's freedom to make their own reproductive health care decisions. I'm concerned about his rulings on net neutrality. I'm concerned about his rulings on the Second Amendment. So I have a series of concerns, and I put those on the table. And we have, I believe, scheduled an interview for him in my office, I think in about 2 weeks. Since he was named, I've been spending time reading his opinions, so that when I get my one chance, I'm not on judiciary to ask him questions in my office. I'm going to have the best ability to ask him the best questions. Tell you what I'm going to do, too. As soon as he's out of my office, I'm going to basically transcribe what he told me and give it to the Judiciary Committee staff, so that as they're prepping the Democrats on the committee for their interview, they will at least have the benefit of what he told me, so they can see, does he answer the question the same way? Does he say different things to different people? I will say one more thing about the Kavanaugh nomination. I encourage every Democrat in the Senate, don't declare until after you have a meeting. Because if you declare I'm against them, then you're not getting the meeting. They don't come meet with you if you've already said you're a no. And I felt like 49 one-on-one meetings for 49 Democratic senators takes some time. and you're more likely to find stuff if you take time. Sadly, about half of my colleagues have come out and immediately declared where they are. They're not getting meetings. So he's going to have to meet with 20 or 25 of us. The other reason that, frankly, I wanted to go, I wanted to extend after the election, but if they get to force it, they get to force it. The other reason that we should take time is, I believe, this is my opinion, as long as there's a vacancy, that Mueller and Rosenstein are protected. I don't think the president can fire Mueller or Rosenstein or try to deep six the Mueller investigation in the middle of a pending Supreme Court nomination battle without blowing up that battle. I mean, one thing the president most wants to do is get the next Supreme Court nominee on. But if he tries to fire Mueller or Rosenstein, the whole hearing will then be about a presidential abuse of power. And what would a judge believe about a presidential abuse of power? He does not want that to happen. So part of the reason for taking time is also to put some bubble wrap around the Mueller investigation and protect it from a president who, I mean, just his tweeting about Sessions, for example, the other day suggests that he's kind of egging Sessions on and trying to get Sessions to do the dirty work to stop it. I think the investigation is protected as long as the vacancy is pending. Come to this side, please.
This is for all. I was just wondering, in worst case scenario, assuming Kavanaugh makes it through, is there a mandate where you can prevent him from forcing an opinion in the Mueller investigation as it relates to Trump? And my second quick question, oftentimes we're convinced that we need term elections, and I know there's some energy this year, and I'm hoping that resonates as well. So I guess I'm wondering, what is Abigail, you'll get out the vote, strategic efforts that
Everybody hear the two questions?
No.
The first half of the question was, if Kavanaugh is confirmed, is there anything that could lead him to recuse himself about anything connected to the Mueller investigation? And the second question was a question for Abigail about voter turnout and get out the vote. let me take the Kavanaugh question, and then I'll let Abigail take the turnout question. I'm obviously working on turnout too, but UK directed it to Abigail.
No,
so-
no, no, I didn't,
Yeah.
you can take it.
Well, I mean, there are others who want to ask questions,
already
so
have it.
if I'm going to get two from you, and then we'll divide the second one into half, so you get three, so I want to try to protect it. On Kavanaugh, the recusal rules for Supreme Court justices are, they only recuse themselves at their own, they get to make their own rule. Now, if you pressured somebody during the hearing, will you commit to that you will recuse yourself, and the individual says yes publicly, then you can probably, not certainly, but you can probably kind of count on it. And I suspect that
That's
he will,
what I was
I suspect he will be pressured on that during the hearing. But the rule about recusal for Supreme Court justices, they get to make the call on their own.
So the question was about turnout and what it is that we're doing to make sure that this midterm election, people remain excited. Heck of a lot is the answer. We have been canvassing, the 7th Congressional District has 10 counties. We go from Culpeper to Henrico, Chesterfield, all the way down to Nottoway. This past weekend, we canvassed in 8 of our 10 counties. We canvass every single weekend. We have 4 shifts every weekend in Henrico and Chesterfield, and we trade out other counties depending upon where our volunteers are. We also are phone banking, regular phone banks, 2 nights a week in Henrico, 1 night a week in Chesterfield, also in Louisa, in Orange, in Powhatan. I think that's it right now. So we are getting volunteers engaged. We're getting volunteers to make constant voter contact. Our campaign is doing a number of public events that we're trying to have across all 10 counties between now and the election to get people excited about the election, get people engaged, and make sure that people recognize that it is partially about flipping the seat. It's about understanding why it's important. It's about knowing that their voice matters. It's about understanding that in parts of the 7th District where it feels like it's not going to happen, it's unflippable, that they're just part of a larger 7th District strategy for our part. And in a district-wide strategy, we need everybody in Henrico and Chesterfield to get out, and we need to lose by a little bit less in some of our redder districts and counties. And we're going to be doing postcards again this year. We're going to have people at the polls. We are doing a lot of education related to absentee ballot for our students and our expats who may not be in the area on election day, and we need all the volunteers we can get. So please sign up if you're interested in that. We also have people driving individuals to the polls. We are working with the coordinated campaign, so we're doing joint canvasses across the district with Senator Kane as well. We're passing literature for both of our campaigns, and in parts of Henrico where we've got the Brooklyn District Supervisor race, we're participating and working with the Democratic nominee there, and in Chesterfield County we're coordinating as well with the Commissioner of the Revenue to make sure that people are aware that it's not just the House and Senate race, but in fact in some of the localities we have additional races that are really important as well.
Let me say one thing before I call on this side, just to emphasize something about Abigail and just an interesting fact about who's running for Congress in Virginia this year. This is a session largely focused on national security. We have 4 Democratic incumbent congresspeople who are very, very solid, running good races. Donald McEachin, Don Beyer, Jerry Connolly, Bobby Scott. We have 7 Democratic challengers running for Congress against 7 seats that are currently Republican. And an interesting thing about the 7, 6 of the 7 are women, and 5 of the 7 have significant national security backgrounds. So, Abby, CIA analyst. I did an event with Elaine Luria this morning, Navy surface ship commander, 20 plus years. Vanjie Williams, a defense analyst for a defense firm up near Dahlgren. Jennifer Wexton, prosecutor at the local level before she was in the state Senate. And Leslie Coburn, who is an investigative journalist for Frontline and 60 Minutes, but heavily focused on national security and diplomacy, global engagement issues. And our other 2 are pretty cool people too. Anthony Flacaveno, who is focused on rural economic development, and Jennifer Lewis, who's a career advocate, a lifetime mental health social worker and advocate. That 5 of our 7 nominees are people with deep national security background is kind of an interesting thing, and that 6 of the 7 nominees are women is also kind of an interesting thing. So, sir, right here.
My name is Joey Flex. My wife and I live in Science Crossroads. We met Abigail before. Good to see you again, and everyone else too. Thank you for not throwing us out, by the way. Appreciate that. You know that.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. You want me to?
You need not worry about whether Abigail Spanberger will do town hall meetings with her constituents. She's
Thank you for explaining that for me. One of the things that I've learned in my professional life is that it takes very little to screw something up. And since the last presidential election, I've seen how little it takes. In fact, they put a lot of effort into that. And given that there's so much work that needs to be done to fix it, what do you see as the outcome of all of that? How long is it going to take? What do you want to do?
Yeah. So never hear a question. President Trump has done a lot of damage to relationships, and Ed was talking about what our allies did. Abigail was talking about getting information and sharing it. The key to security in today's world is as much information sharing between allies as it is the battalion. So because of fantastic U.S. military, we basically pretty much beat ISIS on the battlefield. But they're not giving up. They're just deciding, okay, we're not going to control territory. We'll try to inspire a one-off attack on a jetliner in the Sinai in a neighborhood in Paris. Maybe we can inspire a rogue actor in San Bernardino. That's what they're going to. How do you stop that? You don't stop it with the battalion. You stop it with intel sharing, like, hey, there's somebody here who's got a plane ticket who's coming to the United States, you might want to watch it. Who do you share intel with? You share intel with your allies. If you spend all your time trashing your allies, calling names to Justin Trudeau, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, tearing up NATO, then you're going to share less information and you'll be less safe. So there are a whole series of things where we have been damaged, I believe, by this president. But I'm not a pessimist about this. I think we're in a bad chapter right now, and there's going to be more bad in the chapter. But I think the chapter is going to have a positive end. And the positive end of the chapter is that in this country, the will of people and the strength of institutions is strong enough to counter an overreaching executive. And that's what the framers were worried about in 1787 in Philadelphia. There had been a government of this country that had no executive because they didn't like executives. They hated kings, monarchs, sultans, popes, emperors. They hated them. So we didn't have an executive. And that meant you had a government that wouldn't pay veterans pensions after the Revolutionary War. No, it's your responsibility, no, it's yours. We had to create an executive. But they were very, very worried about the executive tendency to just overreach. They perfectly predicted this moment in time. And so what they did was create